Hello, I'm Neil Gaiman. I'm the author of The Ocean at the End of the Lane. And I'm here to talk to and about book clubs. My first introduction to the world of book clubs was when I finished writing American Gods and persuaded my then wife's book club to read it before it was published. So I got to go and answer questions for them, find out what they thought of a book, and they were my first audience. And that book club became the audience for each of the next of my 3 books. They would read them first, and I'd go and I would always spend a wonderful evening with them, drinking tea, eating cookies, and answering questions. The tea and the cookies, obviously, were the important bit. The questions were secondary. And I love answering questions for book clubs. You guys are fantastic. You read books as a communal, pleasurable thing. You are always opinionated. You are never polite. And whether you're enthusiastic one way or enthusiastic in thinking that a book should not only be burned, but possibly exploded and fired upon by artillery before it is burned, you are always passionate. And so I'm here today to answer a few questions for book clubs that you would probably answer if you could, if you see what I mean. I don't know that there was a particular memory that inspired this book. What there was a huge raft of memories that inspired this book, and more importantly, something that I didn't remember at all. The book began probably 6 years, 7, 8 years before I started writing it, with a conversation with my father when I asked what had happened to the little white Mini that my mother had driven, and why they'd changed it for a large black Rover that I'd hated. And my dad said, "Oh, didn't I tell you that story?" And told me the story of how a lodger from South Africa had gone to the casino in Brighton, lost all of his money, lost all the money that his friends had given him, came back, stole our car and committed suicide in it. And I would have been 7 when this happened. And my immediate reaction was not what it should have been, because what it should have been was empathy, sympathy for that poor man, understanding and appreciation of the tragedy. And instead, when my father told me this, my reaction was, "You mean something interesting happened when I was 7 and I didn't know?" And that little piece of story sat in my head like the bit of dirt that gets into an oyster. And I started building things around it. So everything in the book pretty much is based on and around childhood memories. But it's all based around the vacuum of something that happened that I didn't remember and wanted to create. I like the fact that people read the whole book and do not notice that the narrator does not have a name. That actually makes me happy. I can go through entire days without it ever occurring to me that my name is Neil Gaiman. That is, it's not a very big and not a very important thing. So I started building in, as I wrote the book, a sort of system of naming where some people are only named in their relationship to our narrator. His family. Nobody in the family has a name. There's his sister, his mother, his father, and himself. The lodger doesn't have a name. He's the lodger. People get named by function. sometimes. But then, when names do turn up in the book, they carry a strange kind of freight with them. Letty Hempstock is named, and the Hempstocks are named. Ursula Monckton is gloriously named, and they carry those names around with them. So, would it have changed the book if I'd named the narrator? Would it have changed the book if I told you whose funeral he was at the beginning? Probably only a little. It would have been the equivalent of adding a little more salt to a dish, perhaps. But it would have changed it. The ocean that was at Duck Pond was the place that I went into the story with. It was the thing that was there in a lot of ways even before the story was. The original title of the book, when I was just beginning it, when it was just a story, it was Letty Hempstock's Ocean. And I loved the idea of an ocean, and oceans are illimitable, oceans are huge, oceans are larger than you can fit into your mind. You can just about imagine a sea, but an ocean is vaster than that. The idea of an ocean that was the size of a pond, but contained everything in the universe, just seemed a perfect metaphor for me for everything I was going to try and do in the story. And also a metaphor for story itself. The magic of a book, the magic of a story is it's only this many pages. But you can fit the universe inside. There are people in there. There's a world in there. There's Sussex in 1968 in here. And you can fit that in the same way that you can fit an ocean into a bucket, if you ask it nicely. When I was a little boy, probably the age of the narrator, maybe a bit younger, my mother mentioned to me that one of the farms down our lane was mentioned in the Doomsday Book. And I knew that the Doomsday Book was the book that William the Conqueror had ordered compiled basically as a list of everything in England, in this country he'd taken over. So I knew that was 1,000 years ago. And so as far as I was concerned, the farm down my lane must be 1,000 years old. And I used to think about that. And I just remember one day thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if the people who lived in the farm had been there for 1,000 years and nobody had noticed? And I thought about that for a while. And then somewhere they got a name. And these people who'd lived in this farm for 1,000 years became the Hempstock family. And I kept meaning to write a story with them in. But I never did. So when I wrote Stardust, I liked the idea that some Hempstocks had traveled. So you get to meet Daisy Hempstock. And you know, Tristan's adopted mother is a Hempstock in that. And in the Graveyard Book, I had a witch, and I thought she was probably related to them too. So that's where Liza Hempstock turned up in the Graveyard Book. And I didn't know if I would ever actually get to write the story with the Hempstock family in. And then Ocean at the End of the Lane came along. And because that car was taken down that lane and abandoned, that was just where the Hempstock farm ought to be. So I started writing them. And I felt like they'd been waiting for me since I was 8 or 9. They've been waiting all that time for me to write them, and they've been waiting there, and they were very, very happy to see me, and I was very happy to see them. For many, many years, I've been a subscriber to New Scientist magazine. And mostly, I have to say, I use New Scientist to bore people, because I get to turn around and say, did you know that, given the right combination of fertilizers drifting into a fish pond, your koi can explode? And people say, that's not true. And I'll say, yes, it is. I read it in New Scientist. Or maybe it was in the Fortean Times. Anyway, I think it's true. And that's basically what I normally do with New Scientist. But I read all the articles about what's happening on the borderlines of medicine. And I read with enormous fascination all of the quantum stuff, the theory of universes, the string theory, dark matter. And I come away from these articles knowing maybe just a tiny smidge more than I had before I read them, and in a glorious way, not understanding it at all. So for me, the articles that I read in New Scientist explaining physics as it is right now and cosmogony, these articles are magical realism. So it seemed that if I was going to explain the universe in the Hempstock universe, I would absolutely use science. I would try and make this a book that if you just turn your filter just a little and go, this is science fiction, you can read it absolutely as science fiction. Arthur C. Clarke's third law was any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. And at this point, owning a smartphone, I'm going with him. So I think there's science indistinguishable from magic in this book, and I will leave it to the reader to figure out which is which. Which character in this book would I want as a friend, and which would I not? I would want Letty Hempstock as a friend. Letty was written in order to give a 7-year-old Neil who really didn't have any friends a friend in some ways. And she would be everything that I'd want in a friend, except, of course, she does kind of get them into terrible trouble and nearly get our hero killed. And a lot of the story is because Letty is a little bit overconfident and not quite as in control of things as she should be. But that's okay. I'd want her as a friend. Who would I not want as a friend? I would not want Ursula Monckton as a friend. As an enemy, she is incredibly dangerous. As a friend, I think she would be worse, because she loves trying to make things better for people, but she doesn't have any clue about how to actually make things better. She just gives people what they think they want. And that causes disaster. I like the idea of a book that plays with memory. And I love the way that memory works. Even for me, writing this book was like a strange exercise in memory. When I began writing the book, I remembered the house that I lived in when I was 7, generally. I remembered it mostly from photographs that we still had. I remembered it approximately. As I started writing the book, I started remembering it precisely. Spaces came back, smells came back. Remembering the little patch of lily of the valley by the outside toilet next to the coal shed, and what the wet bricks always smelt like as you went down into the back door, and going, I remember all that. And that wasn't there in my head, but it was somewhere. And the way that we as people keep memories somewhere, and that memories that you don't use get sort of filed like old computer files to the dusty, cobwebby, long-forgotten archives in the hard disk of your head, but they are there when you go and find them. So in this book, memory and forgetting, remembering and forgetting, become themes that run all the way through. And it becomes an exercise in memory. But as you remember, you also visit, you also go there, but you go there as an adult. And what you bring back is what the last chapter's about. Instructions, when I wrote it, was written as a poem that would be a set of instructions about how to survive a fairy tale. When I finished writing it and read what I'd written, I'd realized that on some level, while I'd written a set of instructions for how to survive if you found yourself in a fairy tale, I'd also written a set of instructions for life. It all seemed really good advice. I think that the mind that created instructions, the mind that is incredibly at home in fairy tales, was also the mind that wrote Ocean at the End of the Lane. And they do both arrive at the end at very, very similar places, which is, what do you do when you've finished your quest? What do you do when you come home? And that's always the question that never gets answered properly in any fairy tale. And it's always the place where, unless you can believe in happily ever after, and I've not seen one yet, you always have to go as an author. You know, I don't know if there is any question. Over the years, I've turned up at book clubs, I've eaten cookies and drunk tea and lemonade at book clubs. I've done Skype talks with book clubs, phone talks with book clubs. And there's never been a point where I have looked at the mostly ladies, but not always, of these book clubs and thought, there is a question they are dying to ask, but they never do. Because the glory of book clubs is anything they want to know, when they have an author there, they will ask. Including, they will say things like, so on page 62, where he looks at her, Bob thinks that he really likes her, but I think that he doesn't, and you don't say, which was it? And you say, well, that's up to you as the reader, that's why I don't say. And they both look at each other and they go, no. And you know you've disappointed them, because you should definitely have given it to one or the other. But the glory for me of book clubs is they're never backward in coming forward. They always have their questions, and better than their questions, they always have their opinions. I quite like waffles. The best waffle I ever had was made for me by Teller of Penn and Teller, the comedy group. And I went to see him in Las Vegas, and he said, I am now going to make you a waffle. And he made me the finest waffle I've ever eaten. And there were things in it. It wasn't just a sort of straightforward waffle. It was a waffle with bits and stuff, and it was fantastic. I did have to do homework when I was a child. It was cruel. It was unfair. The only homework I ever actually enjoyed was writing, where we had essays, and sometimes I could go and write a short story. And I would write a story, and I remember really enjoying that. If I could have just gone home every day and written stories, I wouldn't have minded doing homework. But yes, I had to do homework. Even writers have to do homework. It is criminal. Something should be done. Those are almost as good as the best question I was ever asked, which wasn't actually at a book club. It was going to my daughter's school, and all of the kids got to ask me questions. And they asked about books, and they asked about famous people I'd met, and they asked about the Coraline movie, and they asked about Stardust, and they asked all this stuff. And then finally, there was one girl who just kept putting up her hand, and she had a question, and she was the last person. And I said, "What is your question?" And she said, "Have you ever burped so hard it hurt?" I think that's the best question anybody could ever ask an author.